There's a detail from 1194 that most history books include and then immediately move past. A fire tore through the town of Chartres, France. Most of the city burned. The cathedral was thought to be lost. But when the smoke cleared 3 days later, the townspeople found something they weren't expecting. A piece of cloth said to have belonged to the Virgin Mary, stored inside the cathedral, had survived without a single scorch mark. The medieval chroniclers recorded the reaction as unanimous. This wasn't just a religious sign, it was a mandate. Build something worthy of what had been preserved. What followed was one of the most precisely engineered structures in human history. A building that modern architects still struggle to fully explain, and the reason it's difficult to explain has almost nothing to do with faith. I came to this through a different door than most people who write about cathedrals. A friend of mine studies how sound interacts with the human body. She mentioned offhand one afternoon that certain very old stone buildings produce frequencies that modern concert halls are specifically designed to replicate. Frequencies in a range that measurably affects heart rate, breathing, and brainwave patterns, not aesthetically, physiologically. I asked her which buildings. She named 4. 3 were Gothic cathedrals. The 4th was a Neolithic stone circle in Scotland. I spent the next 8 months trying to understand what connected them. What I found wasn't mysticism, it was engineering. And once I understood the engineering, I started to understand why the history we were given left it out almost entirely. The word cathedral comes from the Latin cathedra, meaning seat or chair. Specifically the bishop's chair. The official history tells us cathedrals were built as expressions of religious devotion, as houses of worship, as monuments to faith. All of that is true, but there's something the official history almost never mentions. The Latin root cath comes from the Greek katharos, meaning to cleanse or purify. The same root that gives us catharsis, the emotional and physical purging that Aristotle described when he watched tragedy performed in the theatre. The ancient world didn't separate these concepts the way we do. Purification of the body and purification of the mind were understood as the same process, achieved through the same means. The great Gothic cathedrals of Europe, Notre Dame, Chartres, Cologne, Canterbury, Salisbury, were not built by faith alone. They were built by guilds, and the guilds that built them weren't simply stonemasons following a bishop's instructions. They were organisations that held knowledge which has only partially survived to the modern era. Knowledge about geometry, about acoustics, about the behaviour of light through coloured glass, and about how these elements combined could produce measurable effects in the human nervous system. The stonemasons who built these structures were called Freemasons. Free because they worked with freestone, a fine-grained limestone or sandstone that could be cut in any direction, as opposed to the rougher rubble stone used for simpler buildings. But the freedom in that name meant something else too. They moved between cities, between countries, carrying their technical knowledge with them, beholden to no single lord or bishop. The craft guilds of medieval Europe operated under a knowledge transfer system that had no real equivalent before or since. 7-year apprenticeships, strict standards for what could be built and how. A body of technical knowledge passed directly from person to person, generation to generation, that was never fully written down. That last part matters more than it might seem. Here's what acoustic researchers found when they started studying these buildings seriously. The reverberation time inside Chartres Cathedral, the time it takes for a sound to decay after the source stops, is approximately 5 seconds. That's not unusual for a large stone building. What is unusual is the frequency distribution of that reverberation. The cathedral doesn't amplify sound equally across all frequencies. It specifically amplifies the range between 40 and 60 Hz. That's a very low frequency, below the range of most musical instruments. You feel it more than you hear it. And according to neuroscience research published over the last 2 decades, it's the frequency range associated with the theta state of brain activity. Deep relaxation, reduced cortisol production, and in clinical settings, measurable pain reduction. The building wasn't just beautiful. It was affecting the neurochemistry of everyone inside it. Then Napoleon happened. France's new ruler had grand ambitions for a North American empire. He made a deal with Spain to get Louisiana back, but there was a problem. The Americans depended on the Mississippi River for trade, and the idea of an aggressive, expansionist Napoleon controlling the mouth of that river made them extremely nervous. America approached France about buying New Orleans. Just New Orleans. That's all they asked for. What they got was a phone call, essentially, from Napoleon saying something like, "I've been thinking, and I've decided to sell you everything." Napoleon had calculated that selling Louisiana to the Americans would both fund his European wars and turn America into a permanent ally against Britain. The Americans agreed so fast they probably didn't believe it was real. $15 million for land that doubled the size of the United States overnight. America's population was growing fast, doubling roughly every 20 years. 7 children per family was normal. All those people needed somewhere to go, and there was an almost incomprehensible amount of land to the west, so they went west. Florida came next, purchased from Spain in 1819, then Texas. The Mexican government had actually invited American settlers into its northern territories because the land was difficult to control and sparsely populated. The settlers came in such numbers that they eventually outnumbered the Mexicans, declared independence from Mexico, and created their own republic, then asked to join the United States. This got complicated because Texas had slavery, and the political balance between slave and free states was a constant tension. But in 1845 the US let Texas in. A border dispute led to war with Mexico. When it ended, the US paid Mexico $15 million and took the northern territories, what is now California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of several other states. A few years later, they bought another piece of Mexican territory for $10 million more. Britain agreed to cede the Oregon Territory below a certain line, and just like that, in about 50 years, the United States stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Almost immediately after California became American territory, gold was discovered there. The rush that followed was one of the largest mass migrations in American history. Hundreds of thousands of people from across the country and around the world converged on California with picks and pans and enormous hope. The country was thriving, the territory was vast, the economy was growing. But underneath all of it, a conflict had been building for decades that was going to demand a reckoning. Slavery. In the northern states it was illegal, and increasingly viewed as a moral catastrophe that couldn't be allowed to continue. In the southern states it was the foundation of the entire economic system, and any threat to it was treated as an existential attack. The two sides had been managing this tension through compromise after compromise, but the compromises were running out. When Abraham Lincoln was elected president in 1860, the southern states didn't wait to see what he would do. Most of them simply left. They formed their own country and started a war to defend it. 4 years, enormous casualties on both sides. The bloodiest conflict in American history. The North won. Slavery was abolished. The Union held. It was costly in ways that went beyond the battlefield. Lincoln was assassinated before he could lead the reconstruction he had envisioned. The country spent decades healing, imperfectly, from the wounds of a war that had asked the most fundamental possible question about what America was and what it stood for. In 1867, Russia approached the United States with an interesting offer. Alaska, $7 million. The Secretary of State who negotiated the deal was widely mocked for it. People called it Seward's Folly, a frozen wasteland at the top of the world. What possible use could it be? The purchase went through anyway. Meanwhile, American businessmen had been establishing themselves in Hawaii, and by the early 1890s they had effectively taken control of the islands and were asking Washington to make it official. The sitting president refused, arguing that the United States had no business using its power to take advantage of smaller, weaker nations. His successor had different views, and the argument that won the day was strategic rather than idealistic. If America didn't secure Hawaii, some other major power would, and whoever controlled those islands would have an enormous military advantage in the Pacific. Hawaii was eventually annexed in 1898. The same year, everything in the Caribbean came to a head. The specific pigments used in medieval stained glass produce a light spectrum inside the building that is fundamentally different from natural daylight. The red glass of Gothic cathedrals, produced with copper oxide, transmits light in a range that measurably affects serotonin production. The blue glass, produced with cobalt, transmits frequencies associated with melatonin regulation. We know this now because we have spectrometers. The medieval glaziers knew it through the same empirical observation that guided the stonemasons. They had watched human beings respond to this light for generations. They refined the recipes accordingly. But the dissolution wasn't only English. The suppression of the guilds happened across Europe over 2 centuries, accelerating through the 16th and 17th centuries as the nation-state consolidated power. The Edict of Turgot in France in 1776, just 13 years before the Revolution, abolished the guild system entirely. In England, the Statute of Artificers, which had regulated apprenticeships and wage rates since 1563, was dismantled piece by piece through the early 19th century, with the final apprenticeship clauses repealed in 1814. The Combination Acts of 1799 and 1800 made it illegal for workers to organise in collective bargaining arrangements. One by one, the legal frameworks that allowed the guilds to operate were removed, and with them went the knowledge systems they carried. Here is the pattern that's difficult to explain away. The suppression of the guilds and the rise of industrial wage labour happened simultaneously with the transformation of what cathedrals were for. The buildings themselves didn't change, but their function did. The monastic hospitals were gone. The craft guilds that understood the acoustic and optical engineering were gone. What remained was the shell of the building, pressed into service as a purely religious institution. The healing function quietly removed from the official story. By the 19th century, when historians were writing the accounts we still largely use today, the idea that a stone building could produce measurable physiological effects would have seemed like superstition. These were men of the industrial age. They believed in machines and wages and observable mechanics. The idea that medieval builders had understood something about the human nervous system that their own era had lost, that didn't fit the story of progress, so it was left out. There's a Bulgarian chemist named Valentin Fuster who spent 30 years researching the chemical composition of incense used in Orthodox Christian services. His findings showed that burning frankincense resin activates a specific protein in the nervous system, producing effects that are measurably anxiolytic, meaning it reduces anxiety, and analgesic, meaning it reduces pain. The Church had been burning frankincense in its services for over 1,000 years before this was confirmed chemically. They didn't know the biochemistry, but they knew what happened to people who breathed it in a reverberant stone space, filtered through coloured light, for an hour. They had been watching it happen since the cathedrals were built. I want to be careful here about what I'm actually arguing. I'm not arguing the medieval church was secretly a pharmaceutical company. The faith was real. The devotion was real. The belief that these effects came from the divine was genuine. What I'm arguing is that the effects were also real, and that the people who designed and built these structures understood those effects empirically, generation after generation, and engineered them deliberately. And that understanding, the practical, transmissible guild knowledge of how stone and glass and sound and chemistry interact to produce measurable changes in the human body, was lost. Not gradually, not through neglect, through a specific sequence of legal, economic and political acts carried out over 2 centuries. The same decades that saw the suppression of the guild saw the first stirrings of the patent system, a legal framework that transformed knowledge from a communal, guild-held resource into private property. The English Statute of Monopolies in 1624 is generally described as a landmark in intellectual property law. From another angle, it was the beginning of the legal apparatus that made it impossible to operate the way the guilds had operated, to hold knowledge collectively, to transmit it through apprenticeship, to refuse to disclose it to anyone outside the organisation. The Carpenters' Company of Philadelphia refused Thomas Jefferson access to their rulebook in 1817. By then, that refusal was almost nostalgic. The legal world being built around them was systematically eliminating the conditions that made such collective knowledge possible. I think about the people who built Chartres. They raised a structure in 26 years that has stood for 8 centuries. The nave is 121 feet high. The walls are almost entirely glass, held in place by stone ribs and flying buttresses that still function without modern reinforcement. The building survived 2 world wars, multiple revolutions, and centuries of French weather. When modern engineers have studied it, they found tolerances in the stonework that rival 20th century construction standards. The builders didn't have computers or laser levels. They had geometry passed down through the guild, practical knowledge accumulated over centuries, and they built something that measurably changed the state of every human body that entered it, through sound, through light, through chemistry, through proportions that the nervous system registers even when the conscious mind doesn't notice. We have lost the ability to build what they built, not because we lack the tools. We have tools they never imagined. We've lost it because we dismantled the knowledge system that made it possible. The 7-year apprenticeship that transmitted empirical observation across generations, the guild that held the accumulated understanding of how materials behaved, how sound moved through stone, how light changed across different seasons, the connection between the builder and the building that came from a lifetime spent inside both. When the guild system was dismantled and replaced with wage labour, with patents, with the factory model of production, something was lost that we haven't replaced. We can measure the frequencies inside Chartres now. We can analyse the glass with spectrometers. We can confirm that the building does what the builders intended it to do, but we cannot make another one. The knowledge of how to make another one died in the suppression of the guilds, 2 centuries before we had the instruments to understand what we had lost. My friend visited Chartres last year. She brought a portable decibel meter and a frequency analyzer. She stood in the nave for 20 minutes measuring. Then she put down the equipment and sat in one of the wooden chairs and didn't say anything for a long time. When she came out, she said, "Whatever they were doing, it works." The chair was solid and heavy and very old and still perfectly level, and the questions remain. Why do the acoustic properties of a building constructed in the 12th century match the specifications that modern neurologists would design if asked to create an optimal environment for pain reduction and stress relief? Why was the knowledge of how to produce these effects held in a guild system that was systematically dismantled by the same governments that were simultaneously centralising control over currency, land, and labour? Why do we describe the result as a church, and not as what the acoustic measurements confirm it actually was, a machine for healing, one we don't know how to build anymore, because we destroyed the people who knew?